There is a truth almost nobody wants to hear, and it is this: your mind is not broken, but it has been trained to work against you. Not by some outside enemy, not by bad luck, by repetition, by the thousands of small moments where you agreed, without even noticing, to think smaller than you actually are. You did not choose this on purpose. Nobody sits down one day and decides to build a prison out of their own thoughts. But it happens anyway, quietly, one habit at a time, until the walls feel like they were always there. You are going to walk a path today, not a physical one, a path through territory you have crossed 1,000 times without ever really seeing it, the terrain of your own mind. And by the end of this walk, something is going to shift in how you see the ground beneath your own thinking. Here is what most people never get told. The mind is not a fixed thing. It is not a rock you are stuck carrying for the rest of your life. It is closer to a trail, one that gets carved deeper every time you walk it, and one that can be redirected the moment you choose a new direction. Right now, without knowing it, you have been walking the same old trail for years. Worry leads to worry. Doubt leads to doubt. Small thinking leads to more small thinking. Not because that is who you are, but because that is the path your feet have learned. This is the real problem underneath every other problem you think you have. You believe your circumstances are limiting you, the job, the money, the timing, the people around you. But look closer, and you will find the actual limitation was never outside of you. It was the shape of the trail your mind kept walking, over and over, until it felt like the only road that existed. Most people never question this. They accept the trail as fate. They say, "This is just how I am," and stop looking for the wider land around them. But there is wider land. There always was. You just have not walked far enough off the old path to see it yet. The moment you realize the trail is not the land. Picture someone walking through thick fog on a narrow path. They cannot see anything beyond the few feet in front of them, so they assume the path is all there is, that the world ends where the fog begins. They walk carefully, afraid to step off, because stepping off feels like stepping into nothing. This is not a rare scene. This is most people, most mornings, walking through their own thinking the exact same way, convinced that the narrow strip of thought in front of them is the entire territory of what is possible for their life. You know this feeling even if you have never described it this way before. You wake up and your mind hands you the same 3 or 4 worries it always hands you, the same doubts about money, the same old ache about whether you are behind in life, the same quiet fear that you are somehow not enough, dressed up in 100 different daily costumes so you never quite recognize it as the same fear wearing a new shirt. And because this fog shows up every single day, you start to believe it is simply the weather of your life, permanent, unchangeable, just how things are for someone like you. Nobody sits you down and tells you that fog is not a fixed condition. Nobody explains that fog, by its very nature, is temporary and local, thick in one place and thin 50 feet away, and that the only reason it feels endless is because you have never actually walked far enough to find its edge. Think about what fog actually is for a moment. It is not solid. It is not a wall built from brick and stone that will stop you if you press against it. It is suspended moisture, nothing more, hanging in the air, and it disappears the instant you get close enough to touch it properly. Yet from a distance, from inside it, it convinces you completely. It borrows the appearance of a boundary without ever having the substance of one. This is exactly how most limiting thoughts operate inside your mind. They look, from where you are standing, exactly like walls. They feel just as solid, just as final. But if you were ever brave enough to walk directly into one of them instead of staying safely behind the edge of it, you would discover, almost every single time, that there was nothing there but thin air pretending to be permanent. The tragedy is not that the fog exists. Fog is natural. Everyone encounters uncertainty. 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 The tragedy is that most people never test the fog. They treat the edge of what they can currently see as the edge of what is actually there, and they build their entire life around that false boundary. They stop reaching for a bigger job because the fog around ambition looks thick. They stop trying again after heartbreak because the fog around trust looks impossible to see through. They stop believing they could ever feel calm and steady because the fog around peace has surrounded them for so long they forgot it was ever supposed to lift. Here is the piece almost nobody tells you directly. The moment you take a single step to the side, even a small, uncertain, wobbling step, something remarkable happens. You do not suddenly see the whole valley. You do not get some cinematic reveal where everything becomes clear all at once. What happens is smaller and, in some ways, more powerful than that. You simply notice that the fog moved. It shifted position. It is no longer exactly where it was a moment ago, and in that small shift, you catch a glimpse of something the fog had been hiding the entire time. Space. Actual open space. Wider and more forgiving than the narrow path ever suggested it could be. Your mind works precisely this way. The limits you feel pressing in on you from every direction are, in the overwhelming majority of cases, not real limits at all. They are fog, mistaken for walls, simply because nobody ever encouraged you to reach out your hand and actually touch one to see what it was made of. You inherited this habit of accepting the fog as final. Somewhere early on, you learned that the safest thing to do with an unclear boundary was to respect it as if it were solid, rather than to test it and discover it was mostly empty air. This kept you safe in small, immediate ways. It also kept you small in large, lasting ways, and those two outcomes are not the same thing, even though they often get confused for each other. Consider how differently your life might unfold if you simply adopted one new habit, the habit of treating uncertainty as fog rather than as wall. When a fear shows up telling you that something is impossible, instead of stopping at the edge of that fear and turning back the way you always have, what if you took one step closer to it? Not a leap, not a reckless charge forward, just one honest step, close enough to actually examine what the fear is made of. Most of the time, and this is worth repeating slowly, most of the time, you will discover the fear had no real substance behind it at all. It was moisture in the air, borrowed weight, an old habit of assuming the worst, simply because assuming the worst once felt like the responsible thing to do. This does not mean every fog conceals nothing. Sometimes you step closer, and you do find something real, a genuine obstacle, a genuine risk that deserves respect. But even then, knowing its true shape is infinitely more useful than fearing its imagined shape from a distance. A real obstacle, seen clearly, can be planned around, prepared for, worked through. An imagined wall, feared from a distance, can only be avoided forever, which means you never actually gain any information about whether it was ever really there in the first place. This is the quiet invitation underneath everything you have been taught to believe about your own limitations. You were never told that the fog moves. You were never told that most walls in your mind are simply unexamined distance. You were told, instead, both directly and indirectly, by well-meaning people who were themselves standing in their own fog, to respect the edge of what you could currently see and to stop there. And so you did. And so, most days, you probably still do. But you do not have to keep doing that. The moment you realize, really realize, not just as an idea you nod along with, but as something you actually feel true in your body, that the trail you have been walking is not the same thing as the land itself. Everything about how you approach your own limitations begins to shift. The trail was only ever the visible portion. The land was always larger, wider, more generous than the narrow strip you allowed yourself to walk on. And the good news, the genuinely good news, is that the land does not require permission to be explored. It only requires a willingness to keep walking past the point where the fog usually convinces you to stop. The trail you didn't choose. Nobody remembers choosing their first thoughts about themselves. Nobody sat down as a child with a blank page and decided, carefully and deliberately, exactly what they would believe about their own worth, their own capability, their own place in the world. Instead, those beliefs arrived the way weather arrives, unannounced, shaped by forces far outside your control, and by the time you were old enough to notice you even had them, they already felt like they had always been there, permanent fixtures of your personality rather than what they actually were, which was accidents of circumstance that hardened into habit. A comment from a parent when you were young, said carelessly in a tired moment, repeated in your head for the next 20 years, long after that parent forgot they ever said it. A moment of embarrassment in school, a laugh at the wrong time, a wrong answer given out loud in front of a room full of faces, small in the actual moment, but massive in the version that got stored away and replayed. A single sentence, someone said carelessly, that you, for reasons you still cannot fully explain, decided to carry seriously. Seriously enough that it shaped how you saw yourself for years afterward. Seriously enough that it is still somewhere in the architecture of how you think today, even if you have long since forgotten the exact words or the exact face that said them. These moments carve the first grooves into the trail. Picture rainwater on a hillside with no established path yet, water that could, in theory, flow in any direction across the open slope. But water does not evaluate its options fairly. It follows whatever small dip or depression already exists, even a shallow, barely noticeable one, and the very act of flowing through that shallow dip deepens it slightly, which means the next time it rains, the water is even more likely to follow that same, slightly deeper groove, which deepens it further still. Within a short time, what began as an almost invisible imperfection in the hillside becomes a defined channel, a place where water always goes, not because it is the best route down the hill, but simply because it was the first route, and repetition turned first into permanent. Your early thoughts about yourself behave in precisely the same way. The first groove was rarely chosen with any wisdom or fairness. It was chosen by accident, by whatever happened to be said or felt or witnessed during a particularly impressionable moment. And once that groove existed, your later thoughts, like water on a hillside, simply followed the path of least resistance, flowing again and again into the same worn channel, deepening a belief that was never actually evaluated for whether it was true, only reinforced through sheer repetition until it felt like bedrock. This means the story you tell yourself about who you are, the quiet internal narrative running underneath almost everything you do, was mostly written before you were old enough to argue with it, before you had the tools of reason, perspective, or life experience needed to properly interrogate whether it deserved to be believed at all. A child does not have the capacity to say, calmly, "That comment says more about the tired adult who made it than it does about me." A child simply absorbs. A child simply files the moment away as data, as fact, as something true about the world and about themselves within it. And that filed away moment does not update itself automatically just because you grew older. It sits there, untouched, unless you deliberately go back and examine it with the more capable mind you now have. Here is where most people get stuck, and it is worth naming clearly. They assume that because a belief has been with them a long time, it must be true, or at least too deeply rooted to be worth questioning. Longevity gets mistaken for validity. But a groove being old does not mean it was ever accurate. It only means it has had a long time to deepen through repetition. A false idea, repeated for 20 years, does not become true. It simply becomes familiar, and familiarity has a way of disguising itself as truth if you never stop to check the difference. That is not a life sentence. It is information. And information, unlike sentences, can be re-examined, updated, and in many cases, completely rewritten. Once you know the trail was built, not born, once you understand that the groove in the hillside was carved by accident and reinforced by repetition, rather than being some permanent feature of the land itself, you also know it can be rebuilt. Not instantly, not by simply wishing it away, but rebuilt the same slow way it was originally built, through repetition, except this time chosen deliberately instead of stumbled into by accident. This is a strange kind of relief once it settles in properly. You are not defective. You did not fail at building a healthy sense of self while everyone else somehow succeeded. You simply inherited a trail that was carved before you had any say in the matter, and you have been walking it out of habit ever since, mistaking its familiarity for its correctness. The moment you separate those two things, familiarity and correctness, you gain something valuable: permission to question a belief you have held for decades, without that questioning feeling like betrayal or ingratitude toward wherever the belief originally came from. Think about one belief you have carried since childhood, something about your worth, your intelligence, your lovability, your capability. Now ask yourself honestly whether you ever actually chose that belief, or whether it simply arrived, planted by circumstance, and grew because nothing ever challenged it. Most people, when they actually sit with this question instead of rushing past it, discover that a surprising number of their deepest beliefs about themselves were never chosen at all. They were inherited, absorbed, accepted without trial, the way you might accept a family recipe without ever asking whether you actually like the taste, simply because it was always the recipe used in your house. The work now, the actual work, is not pretending the old groove never existed. It is choosing, deliberately and repeatedly, to let new water flow in a different direction, even though the old channel will always be there, deeper and easier and more familiar, quietly inviting you back into it every single day. Every time you choose the new direction instead, even slightly, even imperfectly, you widen a new groove just a little. It will not feel as natural as the old one for a long time. That is not a sign of failure. That is simply what it feels like to walk a trail that has not yet had years of repetition behind it. Give it time, give it consistency, and the new groove will eventually become the one water flows into automatically, the same way the old one once did. Except this time you will know exactly how it was built, because you built it yourself, on purpose. Small steps change the shape of the land. Here is something rarely explained clearly, something that gets skipped over in almost every conversation about change, as if it were too obvious to mention when it is actually the entire missing piece. You do not change your mind by wanting to change it. Wanting feels productive. Wanting feels like movement, sitting quietly and wishing you thought differently, wishing you were calmer, more confident, less afraid, produces a genuine emotional sensation of progress, a kind of internal motion that convinces you something is happening. But wanting is wind. It moves things temporarily, rustles the surface, creates the appearance of change for as long as it blows, and then it dies down, the way wind always eventually does, and everything settles back exactly to where it was sitting before, undisturbed at its core, no matter how much surface movement occurred while the wind was active. This is why so many people spend years wanting to be different without actually becoming different. They are not lazy. They are not lacking desire. If desire alone were enough, half the people struggling with old patterns would have transformed years ago, given how intensely and how often they have wished for exactly that transformation. The problem was never a shortage of wanting. The problem is that wanting was mistaken for the mechanism of change itself, when wanting is actually only the wind that occasionally reminds you a different direction exists. It was never meant to be the vehicle that gets you there. You change your mind by walking, again and again in a new direction, until that new direction becomes familiar enough to call home. This is a physical process disguised as a mental one. Every time you choose a slightly calmer thought instead of the panicked one that usually shows up first, you are not simply having a nice moment. You are laying down, atom by atom, the beginning of a different path. Every time you choose to speak to yourself the way you would speak to someone you deeply love, instead of the way fear or old criticism usually speaks to you, you are not simply being kind for the sake of being kind. You are depositing one more small layer of material onto a trail that did not exist yesterday and will not feel sturdy for a long while yet. This is slower than people want, and this is precisely where most attempts at change quietly collapse. It is not a single dramatic decision, made once in a powerful moment and then permanently finished. People love the idea of the dramatic decision because it is exciting, because it feels like a movie moment, a single turning point after which everything is simply different. But real change rarely works that way, and expecting it to work that way sets you up to feel like a failure the very first time the old pattern resurfaces, which it almost certainly will, because one dramatic decision does not erase years of deepened grooves. It is, instead, 1,000 small, unglamorous steps in a direction nobody applauds you for. Taken quietly, taken privately, taken on ordinary days when nothing about the moment feels significant or worth remembering. Nobody claps when you choose a calmer thought at 11 at night instead of spiraling into the usual worry. Nobody notices when you catch yourself mid-criticism and soften the words before you finish the sentence in your head. These moments happen invisibly, inside you, unseen by anyone, and because they are unseen, it is easy to underestimate their importance, to feel like nothing real is happening, simply because nothing external is confirming it. But this is exactly how trails get carved. Not through witnessed, celebrated, singular events, but through repeated, private, mostly unnoticed footsteps, taken over and over, until the ground itself begins to remember the shape of where you have been walking. None of this feels powerful in the moment. This deserves to be said plainly, because it is one of the most discouraging parts of the entire process, and almost nobody warns you about it in advance. Choosing the harder, healthier thought instead of the easy, familiar, destructive one usually feels small, uncertain, even slightly foolish, especially in the beginning. It does not come with a rush of triumph most of the time. It often just feels like effort, like resistance, like walking uphill on unfamiliar ground, while the old, worn path sits right there beside you, calling you back with all the comfort of familiarity. This is normal. This is not a sign you are doing it wrong. This is simply what new trails feel like before they have had enough time to become the easier route. But trails are not carved by one step. They are carved by consistency. A single walk across a grassy field leaves almost no trace behind, barely a bent blade of grass that straightens itself back upright within a day. Nobody would look at that field after one crossing and see any indication a path exists there at all, but walk that same line every single day for a month, and something entirely different begins to happen. The grass stops springing back. The dirt underneath begins to show. A visible, defined trail starts to emerge, not because any single walk was special or dramatic, but because the sheer repetition of ordinary, unremarkable steps eventually rewrites the appearance of the land itself. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it changes how you should measure your own progress. If you are waiting to feel a dramatic internal shift before you believe change is actually happening, you will likely wait a very long time, possibly long enough to give up entirely, concluding that whatever method you are using simply is not working for you. But if you measure progress instead by consistency, by how many times you chose the new direction regardless of how unremarkable each individual choice felt, you will notice something the dramatic shift seekers usually miss entirely. The trail is already forming. It is forming beneath the surface of your awareness, the same way the physical trail forms in the field, before it becomes visible to anyone looking at it from a distance. There is also a quiet trap worth naming here. On days when the old trail wins, when you catch yourself falling back into the familiar groove of panic, self-criticism, or fear, it is easy to interpret this as proof that nothing has changed, that all your previous small steps were wasted, that you are back exactly where you started. This is rarely true, and believing it tends to do more damage than the actual slip itself. Old, deeply worn trails do not disappear the moment a new one begins forming beside them. They remain there, easy to fall back into, sometimes for a very long time, even while the new trail is genuinely, steadily strengthening underneath. A single day of walking the old path does not erase the weeks of walking the new one. It only means the old groove still exists, which was always expected, and which says nothing about whether your new direction is working. The real measure, then, is not perfection. It is direction, repeated often enough that it eventually becomes the path your mind reaches for first, automatically, the way it currently reaches for the old one. This will not happen overnight, and it was never going to. But every small, quiet, unglamorous choice you make toward the calmer thought, the kinder words, the steadier response, is not wasted effort simply because it feels small in the moment. It is exactly the kind of effort that shapes land over time, slow, repeated, mostly invisible, until one day you notice the new trail feels less like effort and more like simply the way you naturally walk now. The weight you are allowed to put down. Somewhere along the way, you picked up ideas that were never yours to carry. Nobody handed them to you in a single clear moment, with a label attached explaining what they were or where they came from. They arrived gradually, absorbed from 100 different sources, a parent's unspoken expectations, a culture's quiet definitions of what success is supposed to look like, a comparison made in passing that lodged itself somewhere and never quite left. Ideas about what success has to look like, about the exact shape a good life is supposed to take. The house, the title, the timeline, the milestones that are supposed to arrive by certain ages, or you are somehow already behind. Ideas about what makes you worthy, worthy of love, worthy of respect, worthy of taking up space in a room without apologizing for it. Ideas about how much you are allowed to want out of this life, as if wanting itself had a ceiling, as if desiring more than what you currently have was somehow greedy or ungrateful, rather than simply human. You did not choose these ideas any more than a traveler chooses the terrain they were born walking. A person born in the mountains does not select mountains as their landscape. They simply open their eyes one day and the mountains are already there, already shaping how they walk, how far they can see, how much effort each step requires. In the same way, you did not select the emotional terrain you were born into. You did not choose the household's particular anxieties, the community's particular definitions of a life well lived, the era's particular pressures about time, money, and worth. These things were simply already there, shaping you before you had any capacity to evaluate whether you agreed with them. But you are the one still carrying them, mile after mile, long after the people who handed them to you have moved on and forgotten they ever handed you anything at all. This is perhaps the strangest part of the entire situation. The parent whose offhand comment about ambition still echoes in your decision-making may not even remember saying it. The friend whose casual remark about what a real career looks like has likely long forgotten the conversation entirely. They set the weight down decades ago, or never even realized they were handing you a weight in the first place, while you have continued carrying it faithfully, day after day, as though putting it down would somehow be a betrayal of the moment it was given to you. This is the strange cruelty of an unexamined mind, that you can spend decades exhausted from a weight nobody is currently forcing you to hold. Nobody is standing behind you, insisting you keep carrying it. Nobody would even notice if you set it down right now, in this very moment. The only thing keeping the weight on your shoulders is the sheer habit of having carried it for so long that carrying it started to feel like an identity rather than a choice, like something fundamental about who you are rather than something you simply never got around to questioning. Think about how physical weight works for a moment, and let the comparison sit honestly. If someone hands you a heavy bag at the start of a long walk, and you carry it faithfully for miles, your shoulders adjust. Your posture adapts around the weight. After enough time, the ache becomes so constant that you stop registering it as an ache at all. It simply becomes the baseline feeling of walking, the normal state of your body, no longer something remarkable enough to notice consciously. This is exactly what happens with the emotional and psychological weight you inherited. You have carried certain expectations, certain definitions of worth, certain fears about not measuring up, for so long that the discomfort of carrying them has faded into the background, mistaken for simply how life feels rather than recognized as an optional burden you never actually agreed to keep holding. The moment you notice this, you get a choice you didn't know you had. This is worth pausing on, because noticing is genuinely the entire turning point, not fixing, not immediately transforming your entire relationship to success or worth or ambition. Simply noticing, clearly and honestly, that a particular weight exists, that it has a source, and that the source was not you. This single act of noticing is what separates an unexamined burden from an examined one. And examined burdens, unlike unexamined ones, can actually be evaluated instead of simply endured. Not the choice to instantly become fearless. That expectation sets people up to fail before they even begin, because fearlessness was never the actual goal, and demanding it of yourself immediately only adds another layer of pressure onto an already heavy load. Just the choice to ask, honestly, without rushing toward an answer, is this mine to carry, or did I just forget to put it down? This question alone, asked sincerely and repeated whenever a familiar heaviness shows up, begins to do something remarkable over time. It interrupts the automatic nature of the weight carrying. It introduces a pause where there used to be only unconscious habit. Consider, specifically, the idea of success measured by a timeline you never actually agreed to. Where did the belief come from that you should have achieved a certain thing by a certain age? Trace it back honestly. Did you arrive at that timeline through careful, independent reflection about what actually matters to you, or did it arrive from watching other people's lives unfold on social media, from comparisons made at family gatherings, from a culture that markets certain milestones as universal requirements rather than optional preferences? Most people, tracing this honestly for the first time, discover the timeline was never truly theirs. It was borrowed, absorbed, adopted without ever being examined, and yet it has been pressing down on their shoulders for years as though it carried the full authority of personal conviction. The same tracing exercise applies to worth. Somewhere, someone taught you, directly or indirectly, that worth had to be earned through achievement, through productivity, through constant proving. Nobody sat you down and asked whether you agreed with this definition before installing it. It simply became the operating assumption underneath your daily choices, the quiet voice explaining why rest feels like guilt, and why accomplishment never quite satisfies the way it was supposed to. Once you see this clearly, once you recognize the weight for what it is, borrowed, not built, inherited, not chosen, You gain the standing to finally ask whether it deserves to keep riding on your back for the rest of your life. Putting the weight down does not mean pretending it never mattered or that the people who handed it to you were villains. Most of the time, they were simply carrying their own inherited weight, passing it along the only way they knew how, the same way weight has likely been passed down for generations before either of you were born. Putting the weight down simply means recognizing that inheritance is not obligation, that you are allowed to receive something from your history without being required to carry it forward unchanged for the rest of your own life. You can honor where a belief came from while still choosing, deliberately and without guilt, to no longer let it define how heavy your daily walk feels. This is not a single dramatic unburdening either, much like everything else on this walk. It is a repeated practice of noticing weight, questioning its origin, and gently, without force, choosing to set down whatever does not actually belong to you. Some days you will forget and pick the old weight right back up out of habit. That is expected. The goal is not permanent, effortless lightness overnight. The goal is simply remembering, more and more often, that you were never actually required to carry any of this in the first place, and that every single day offers a fresh opportunity to ask the question honestly, and, this time, to actually listen to the answer. Fear disguised as practicality. Fear rarely announces itself directly. It almost never walks up to you and says plainly, "I am afraid, so let's not do this." If it did, you would likely recognize it immediately and respond to it accordingly, weighing the fear honestly against what you actually want. Instead, fear disguises itself as being realistic, as being responsible, as just being smart about it. It borrows the language of maturity and caution, dressing itself up in words that sound like wisdom, so that by the time it finishes speaking, you are not even aware you were listening to fear at all. You believe, sincerely, that you were simply being sensible. You tell yourself you are protecting yourself by staying small, by not trying, by expecting little, and there is a certain internal logic to this that makes it feel convincing. If you never reach for something bigger, you never have to feel the specific sting of falling short of it. If you never fully try, you always retain the quiet comfort of believing you could have succeeded if you had truly given it everything. An untested belief that, precisely because it remains untested, can never be disproven. This feels, in the moment, like protection. It feels like wisdom. But protection and avoidance are not the same road, even though they look remarkably similar from a distance. Similar enough that most people walk the avoidance road for years while sincerely believing they are walking the protection road instead. Consider the difference carefully, because the distinction matters more than it might first appear. Genuine protection involves clear-eyed assessment of real risk, followed by reasonable precaution. If a bridge is structurally unsound, choosing not to cross it is protection, grounded in an actual, verifiable danger. Avoidance, on the other hand, involves refusing to approach the bridge at all, refusing even to walk close enough to examine whether it is actually unsound, simply because the possibility of it being unsound feels uncomfortable to consider. Avoidance never tests its own assumptions. It treats the discomfort of uncertainty as sufficient proof of danger, without ever gathering the information that would confirm or deny whether real danger exists at all. A traveler who refuses to leave the same 3 miles of trail because the unknown feels dangerous is not being careful. Notice the specific phrase there, feels dangerous, not is dangerous. This distinction is the entire hinge on which fear disguised as practicality turns. The traveler has not actually encountered evidence that the unfamiliar terrain beyond their 3 miles is unsafe. They have only encountered the internal sensation of unfamiliarity, and that sensation, uncomfortable as it is, has been mistaken for a reliable signal of actual risk. They are trading the discomfort of growth for the numbness of staying exactly where they are, and because numbness is quieter, Less immediately painful than the discomfort of the unknown, it wins the daily competition for their attention, over and over, one ordinary day at a time. The mind does this constantly, calling it wisdom, when really it is just an old, tired habit wearing a disguise. This is worth sitting with honestly, because most people, if asked directly whether they are avoiding something out of fear, will answer no, will explain, often quite persuasively, all the practical reasons why staying where they are simply makes more sense right now. And sometimes, to be fair, this is genuinely true. Not every hesitation is fear in costume. But far more often than people realize, the practical-sounding explanation is simply fear that has learned, over years of repetition, exactly which words make it sound reasonable enough to go unquestioned. Think about how this shows up in ordinary, everyday decisions, not just the large, obvious ones. The idea for a project that never gets started because the timing never feels quite right. A delay that somehow always finds a new justification every time the old one expires. The conversation that never gets had because it seems wiser to wait for a calmer moment that, curiously, never actually arrives. The application never submitted because there is always one more qualification worth acquiring first, one more year of preparation that always somehow needs one more year added onto it. Each of these delays, examined individually, sounds entirely sensible. Strung together across months and years, they reveal a pattern that has very little to do with sensible timing and everything to do with fear finding new, more sophisticated justifications each time the old ones wear thin. This does not mean every act of caution deserves suspicion. Genuine practicality exists and matters. The skill worth developing is not blanket distrust of every cautious impulse, but rather an honest habit of pausing to ask which kind of caution you are actually experiencing in this specific moment. Does this hesitation come from a clear, examined risk that I could explain concretely if pressed to do so, or does it come from a vague, uncomfortable feeling that I have not actually investigated, dressed up afterward in language that sounds responsible? One useful test, though imperfect, is to ask whether the reasoning changes each time the previous reasoning gets addressed. If you tell yourself you are waiting until you have more experience, and then once you gain that experience, you find yourself waiting until you have more confidence, and then once confidence arrives, you find yourself waiting for better timing, this shifting justification is often a signal that the actual obstacle was never really any of the stated reasons. The stated reasons were simply fear's rotating wardrobe, a fresh outfit pulled out each time the previous one stopped fitting convincingly. Another useful signal is imagining how you would advise someone else facing the identical situation. Distance tends to strip away the disguise that fear wears so effectively when it is speaking directly to you. If a close friend described the exact same hesitation, using the exact same practical-sounding reasons, would you nod along and agree they were being wise? Or would you gently suspect that something deeper, something more fearful, was actually driving the decision? Most people find they can see through the disguise far more easily in someone else's story than in their own, which is precisely why this exercise is worth doing deliberately rather than assuming your own internal read is automatically accurate. None of this means fear is something to be ashamed of or eliminated entirely. Fear, in its honest form, actually serves a real purpose, alerting you to genuine risk, prompting genuine caution where genuine caution is warranted. The goal is not to silence fear altogether, which would be neither possible nor wise. The goal is simply to stop letting fear operate under an assumed name, to stop mistaking its voice for the voice of practical wisdom simply because it has gotten skilled, through years of repetition, at sounding exactly like it. Once you can recognize fear, even when it is wearing its most convincing disguise, you retain the choice of whether to listen to it this time or to walk past it, eyes open, fully aware of what you are actually doing, rather than sincerely believing you are simply being sensible. The direction matters more than the speed. You do not need to sprint toward change, and this deserves to be said plainly, because so much of what gets taught about personal growth implies the opposite, implies urgency, implies that if you are not transforming quickly, you must be doing something wrong or lacking sufficient commitment. Most people give up not because they are lazy, a word that gets thrown around far too casually and almost never actually describes what is really happening, but because they expected the new trail to feel solid immediately, the way the old one did, and when it didn't, they interpreted that instability as proof the new direction was somehow the wrong one. It won't feel solid immediately, and understanding why in advance can save you from abandoning something that was actually working simply because it did not yet feel comfortable. New paths always feel unstable at first, simply because they are new, not because they are wrong. Every trail, without exception, felt uncertain underfoot the very first time it was walked. The oldest, most familiar path in your mind, the one that currently feels automatic and easy, once felt exactly as wobbly and unfamiliar as the new one currently does. It only became solid through repetition, through enough footsteps that the ground itself learned the shape of your walking. There was never a shortcut around that early instability, not for the old trail and not for the new one either. This distinction matters enormously because it changes how you interpret discomfort during the early stages of change. If you believe solidity should arrive quickly, then the wobble you feel after only a few days or weeks of trying to think differently gets interpreted as failure, as evidence that this particular new direction simply is not for you, and you retreat back to the old, comfortable groove, concluding that change was attempted and did not work. But if you understand in advance that wobble is simply what new trails feel like, regardless of whether they are ultimately the right direction, then that same discomfort no longer functions as a stop sign. It becomes simply part of the expected terrain, something to walk through rather than something to be alarmed by. What matters is not how fast you walk the new direction. What matters is that you keep facing it. Picture two travelers setting out toward the same distant point. One moves quickly at first, driven by enthusiasm, covering significant ground in the early days, but grows discouraged when the initial burst of motivation fades and eventually turns back toward familiar territory. The other moves slowly, sometimes barely advancing at all on difficult days, but never actually turns around, never faces backward toward the old direction even when progress feels painfully slow. Over enough time, the second traveler ends up farther along than the first, not because they moved faster on any given day, but because they never stopped facing the right way. A slow step toward growth still moves you forward. This sounds almost too simple to be worth stating, and yet it is exactly the truth that gets lost most often in practice. A single small choice, a slightly calmer response instead of the usual panic, a slightly kinder thought instead of the usual self-criticism, might feel insignificant in isolation, barely worth counting as progress at all. But it is not measured against some imaginary finish line that needed to be reached today. It is measured simply against the direction it points, and a slow step in the right direction remains, undeniably, a step in the right direction, regardless of how small it was or how long it took. A fast sprint back into old thinking still takes you backward. This is the other half of the same principle, and it explains why intensity alone was never the deciding factor in whether change actually takes hold. Someone might spend an enormous burst of energy in a single difficult moment, reverting entirely to the old patterns, the old fears, the old harsh self-talk, and that burst of backward motion, however brief, still moves them away from where they were trying to go, regardless of how much forward progress preceded it. Direction, not speed, decides where you eventually stand. And this single fact reframes almost everything about how change should actually be pursued. This reframing matters practically,
not just philosophically.
If direction is what counts rather than speed, then the appropriate response to a slow day is not despair or self-criticism about insufficient progress. The appropriate response is simply continuing to face the right way, even if today's actual movement was minimal. Some days genuinely will produce very little visible forward motion. Exhaustion happens. Old habits resurface under stress. Difficult circumstances make even small, healthy choices feel disproportionately hard. None of this needs to be interpreted as failure, provided the overall direction remains intact, provided you have not actually turned around to face backward, even if your forward motion on any particular day was nearly imperceptible. There is also a subtler danger worth naming here, the danger of comparing your pace to someone else's. Because change is largely invisible from the outside, it is easy to look at another person and assume they are moving faster than you, transforming more efficiently, covering more ground in less time. But you rarely have access to their actual internal terrain, how many old grooves they are working against, how much early support or disadvantage shaped the beginning of their walk, how many quiet setbacks happened privately, unseen by anyone watching from a distance. Comparing your pace to a pace you cannot actually verify accurately is a reliable way to manufacture discouragement out of nothing solid, and it distracts from the only measurement that actually matters for your own walk, which is simply whether you are still facing the right direction today, regardless of how quickly or slowly you happen to be moving in it. Patience in this context is not passive waiting. It is not simply enduring discomfort until change magically arrives on its own. It is active, repeated choosing, over and over, to keep facing forward even when forward motion is slow, even when the ground still feels unfamiliar underfoot, even when the old trail remains tempting precisely because it requires no new effort to walk. This kind of patience is a skill, not a personality trait some people simply have and others simply lack. And like any skill, it strengthens the more it gets practiced, particularly on the difficult days when facing forward feels far harder than simply giving up and turning back toward what is familiar. Company changes the terrain. Notice who you walk beside, because this single factor shapes your internal terrain more powerfully and more consistently than almost anything else you might try to control directly. The people around you are not neutral scenery, passive background figures who exist alongside your life without actually influencing it. They are either widening your sense of what's possible or quietly narrowing it, sentence by sentence, conversation by conversation, without either of you consciously noticing the shift happening in real time. Spend enough time near people who see limits everywhere, who respond to new ideas with immediate lists of reasons they will not work, who describe their own lives primarily in terms of what they cannot do, rather than what remains open to them, and you will start seeing limits everywhere too, even in places you once saw open ground. This is not a moral failing on your part or theirs, it is simply how proximity works. You absorb, gradually and mostly unconsciously, the emotional and perceptual habits of the people you spend the most time around, the same way you absorb an accent from a region you live in long enough without ever deciding deliberately to start speaking that way. Think about how this operates practically. In ordinary conversation, you mention an idea, something you are considering trying, and the response you receive shapes, more than you probably realize, how that idea continues to live inside you afterward. A response focused on obstacles, on everything that could go wrong, on all the reasons the timing is bad or the plan is flawed, tends to plant itself and grow, even if you consciously disagree with it in the moment. A response focused on possibility, on what might work, on genuine curiosity about how you might navigate the obstacles rather than treating the obstacles as automatic disqualifiers, tends to plant a very different kind of seed, one that grows toward expansion rather than contraction. This does not mean you need people who agree with everything you say or who offer empty, unrealistic encouragement regardless of the actual merits of an idea. That kind of company creates its own problems, a different kind of narrowed terrain built on avoidance of honest feedback rather than on excessive caution. What matters is not agreement, but orientation. Whether the people around you generally orient toward what is possible, even while being honest about real challenges, or whether they generally orient toward what is impossible, even when genuine possibility exists. This does not mean cutting people off in anger. And this distinction matters because the instinct, once you notice this pattern clearly, often swings toward drastic action, toward suddenly eliminating anyone whose company does not feel expansive. That kind of reaction usually causes more harm than the narrowing terrain itself, particularly when the people in question are family, longtime friends, or others with whom your life remains genuinely intertwined, regardless of how their perspective happens to shape your thinking. It means noticing, honestly, which company leaves you feeling like the land is bigger than you thought, and which company leaves you feeling like the fog is closing in again, and using that honest noticing to inform how much weight you give their perspective, how much time you spend absorbing their particular way of seeing the world, without necessarily requiring a dramatic severing of the relationship altogether. There is a useful practice here, simple, but rarely done deliberately. After spending time with someone, pause afterward and notice honestly how you feel about your own life and your own possibilities compared to how you felt before the conversation. Do you feel slightly more expansive, slightly more willing to consider trying something, slightly more hopeful about navigating whatever challenge you happen to be facing? Or do you feel slightly smaller, slightly more resigned, slightly more convinced that things probably will not work out the way you had hoped? This feeling, tracked honestly and consistently over time across many different people and many different conversations, provides remarkably accurate information about which relationships are widening your terrain and which are quietly narrowing it. Information that is far more reliable than simply asking whether you enjoy someone's company in the moment, since enjoyable company and expansive company are not always the same thing. It is also worth noticing how you yourself show up for others, because the terrain-shaping effect runs in both directions simultaneously. If you have absorbed a habit of responding to other people's ideas primarily with caution, with lists of reasons something will not work, with quiet skepticism dressed up as realism, you are participating in narrowing someone else's terrain, likely without any intention of doing so, simply because narrowing has become your habitual response to uncertainty. Becoming aware of this does not mean forcing false enthusiasm you do not actually feel. It means cultivating genuine curiosity as your default response to uncertainty, both in yourself and in how you engage with others. Curiosity being the quality that keeps terrain open in both directions, allowing challenges to be examined honestly, without those challenges being mistaken for final verdicts. There is also the matter of the voices you spend time with, beyond the people physically present in your life, the media you consume, the content you scroll through, the messages absorbed passively during ordinary moments of distraction. These voices shape terrain just as powerfully as in-person company, sometimes more powerfully, given how much time modern life spends absorbing them. A steady diet of content that emphasizes scarcity, competition, and everything currently wrong with the world will narrow your sense of what's possible, just as surely as spending time with a person who does the same thing in conversation, even though no actual person was involved in the exchange. None of this requires perfection or constant vigilance to the point of exhaustion. It simply requires periodic honesty about which influences, human and otherwise, tend to widen your sense of what's available to you, and which tend to quietly close it in. Over enough time, this awareness allows you to make small, deliberate adjustments. More time here, less time there, not out of rigid rule following, but out of a genuine understanding that the terrain of your own mind is shaped, continuously and significantly, by whoever and whatever you allow to walk alongside you most often. The view from higher ground. There is a particular kind of clarity that only comes from gaining a little height, a hill, a ridge, any place where you can finally see the whole valley instead of just the next few steps directly in front of you. Down in the valley, walking through your daily concerns at ground level, your field of vision is limited to whatever is closest, whatever is loudest, whatever is currently pressing against you most insistently. This is not a flaw in how your mind works. It is simply the natural consequence of perspective, of being embedded directly inside a situation, rather than observing it from some distance away. From down in the fog, every worry looks enormous, close, unavoidable, filling nearly the entire field of vision the way a single object held directly against your eye blocks out everything else in the room, regardless of how small that object might actually be from a normal viewing distance. This is worth understanding literally, not just as a metaphor. Proximity distorts size. A minor obstacle, examined from 3 inches away with your full attention locked onto it, can feel more threatening and more all-encompassing than a genuinely significant challenge viewed from a healthy distance with some perspective intact. From higher ground, that same worry becomes small enough to fit in your palm, one detail among many, not the entire landscape. This shift does not happen because the worry itself changed in any objective sense. The actual size and difficulty of the challenge remains exactly the same before and after you gain height. What changes is your position relative to it, and that change in position is often enough, entirely on its own, to transform something that felt overwhelming into something that feels manageable, simply because you can now see it alongside everything else in your life, rather than as the sole occupant of your attention. You do not need a mountain. This matters because the instinct, once you understand the value of higher ground, is often to search for some dramatic, large-scale version of it, a major life change, an extended retreat, some significant event that grants access to sweeping perspective all at once. But genuine higher ground is available in far smaller, far more accessible forms than that, available in fact almost any time you choose to access it, provided you know what you are actually looking for. You need a habit of stepping back, even for 5 quiet minutes, and asking what this looks like from slightly above your own panic. Consider what stepping back actually involves in practice, because it is less mysterious than it might initially sound. It might mean simply pausing before responding to a stressful message, giving yourself even a few minutes of distance before reacting, enough time for the immediate emotional intensity to settle slightly, so that a broader view becomes accessible. It might mean asking yourself directly how this particular worry will likely look to you in a year, in 5 years. A question that does not dismiss the worry's current importance, but does provide a useful comparison point, a reminder that your current field of vision, however consuming it feels right now, is not necessarily the permanent, unchangeable shape of things. It might mean writing the worry down on paper and looking at it as a piece of text rather than as a swirling, unformed feeling inside your chest. A surprisingly effective way to gain a small amount of distance, since a written sentence occupies a fixed, containable size on a page in a way that an internal feeling often does not. It might mean simply stepping outside, walking for a few minutes without your phone, allowing the physical change of environment to create a small mental change of environment alongside it. Since these two things, physical and mental space, tend to influence each other more than people often expect. Almost everything shrinks a little when you stop standing directly inside it. This is worth testing directly rather than simply accepting as an abstract claim. Recall a difficulty from several years ago, something that, at the time, felt genuinely overwhelming, consuming enormous amounts of your attention and worry. Notice how it feels now, from this distance. Whether the same difficulty still carries the same enormous weight it once did, or whether it has settled into something smaller, more ordinary. One memory among many, rather than the defining crisis it felt like while you were standing directly inside it. This shrinking effect is not a special property of that particular old difficulty. It is simply what distance does, reliably and predictably, to nearly everything you have ever worried about, which suggests that a great deal of your current overwhelm, right now, in this present moment, would likely shrink in exactly the same way if you could only find a way to access even a small amount of that same distance while you are still inside the situation, rather than waiting years for time to provide it for you naturally. This does not mean minimizing genuinely serious challenges or pretending real difficulties are not real. Higher ground does not erase the actual size or importance of what you are facing. What it offers instead is context, the ability to see a difficult situation alongside everything else that also exists in your life, rather than allowing it to occupy your entire field of vision as though nothing else were happening simultaneously. A genuine crisis remains a genuine crisis even from higher ground. But even genuine crises are navigated more effectively from a position of some perspective than from a position of complete immersion, where panic itself becomes an additional obstacle layered on top of whatever the actual difficulty happens to be. Building this habit, the habit of periodically seeking higher ground even in small, accessible ways, changes the overall texture of how your daily life feels over time. Instead of moving from one consuming worry directly into the next, each one filling your entire field of vision in turn, you begin developing a rhythm of engagement and distance, immersing yourself fully in what needs your attention, and then periodically stepping back to remember the wider landscape that immersion tends to make you forget exists. This rhythm, practiced consistently, does more to protect your sense of perspective than almost any single strategy aimed at solving individual problems one at a time, because it addresses the underlying pattern, the habit of staying too close to everything for too long, rather than simply addressing whatever the current worry happens to be. Here is the moment that actually matters, the one thing worth remembering long after you forget the rest of this. The mind does not need to be fixed. It needs to be walked differently. You are not broken, and you are never lacking whatever it is that other people seem to have. You have simply been walking a well-worn trail without realizing there was ever any other direction to face. The moment you understand that thought is a path, not a prison, everything changes. Not instantly, not without effort, but certainly, step by step, the way any real trail is ever made. So here is where we end up, back where we started, in the fog, except now you know something the version of you at the beginning didn't. The fog was never a wall. It was only unfamiliar ground, waiting for someone brave enough to take one more step than usual. You have that in you. You always did. The only thing left is choosing, today, which direction your next step actually faces. If this spoke to something in you, subscribe, because there is more of this waiting for you.